Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers, or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honored to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away, both listening as the stars come out? If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. Picture this. You're standing in the shadow of Hampton Court Palace, your hands trembling as a royal messenger pounds on your door at dawn. The year is 1538, and you've just been summoned to serve as personal physician to the most dangerous man in England, Henry VIII. Your heart races because you know the grim statistics. Of the king's previous doctors, some have fled in terror, others have been executed for their failures, and the rest have simply disappeared. You clutch your leather satchel containing primitive surgical tools, bottles of mercury and jars of leeches, knowing full well that these medieval remedies are about as effective as praying to stop a charging bull. But here's the terrifying truth. You have no choice but to try, because refusing the king means certain death, and failing him, well, that might mean an even worse fate. Welcome to your new reality as Henry VIII's doctor, where every diagnosis could be your last, every treatment a gamble with your own life, and where the line between healer and victim becomes horrifyingly thin. You're about to discover why being a royal physician in Tudor England wasn't just the most prestigious medical position in the realm. It was quite possibly the most dangerous job in all of Europe. Your first challenge hits you before you even meet the king. As you're escorted through the palace corridors, past tapestries worth more than entire villages, you catch your first whiff of what awaits you. The stench is overwhelming, a nauseating cocktail of rotting flesh, infected wounds, and bodily fluids that haven't been properly cleaned in weeks. The courtiers you pass hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses, but you don't have that luxury. You're walking directly toward the source of that smell. The massive oak doors swing open, and there he is, Henry VIII, King of England, defender of the faith, and your new patient. But this isn't the robust, athletic monarch from his younger portraits. This is a man transformed into a living nightmare of medical horrors. At 47 years old, Henry weighs nearly 400 pounds, his body a bloated monument to excess and decay. His face is puffy and mottled, his breathing laboured and wheezing. But it's his leg that makes your stomach lurch. The king's left leg is a grotesque spectacle of medieval medicine gone wrong. What started as a jousting injury years ago has become an ulcerous, weeping wound that refuses to heal. The flesh around it is blackened and putrid, constantly oozing a mixture of pus and blood that stains his elaborate stockings. The smell is so overpowering that even the king's closest advisors struggle not to gag in his presence. And now, this festering catastrophe is your responsibility. "Doctor," the king growls, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority and barely contained rage. "My previous physician assured me this wound would heal within a fortnight. That was 6 months ago. He now decorates a spike outside the Tower of London. I trust you'll be more successful." Your mouth goes dry as you realize the full scope of your predicament. You're looking at a leg wound that, by all medical understanding of your time, should have killed the king months ago. The infection is clearly spreading, turning his blood poisonous and his temper even more volatile than usual. With your primitive understanding of anatomy and complete ignorance of germ theory, you're essentially being asked to perform a miracle with tools that belong in a torture chamber. But here's what makes your situation truly hellish. You can't simply tell the king that his wound is beyond help. Henry has already executed physicians for delivering unwelcome news. Dr. William Butts, one of Henry's earlier doctors, once made the mistake of suggesting that the king's lifestyle might be contributing to his health problems. He barely escaped with his life and only because Henry was in an unusually merciful mood that day. Your training, such as it was, consisted of studying the works of ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Galen and Hippocrates, men who had been dead for over 1,000 years and whose understanding of the human body was fundamentally flawed. You believe that illness is caused by an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Your treatment options are limited to bloodletting, purging, administering toxic mercury compounds, and applying leeches to draw out bad blood. As you examine the king's putrid leg wound, trying not to vomit from the stench, you realize that everything you've learned about medicine is not just useless, it's actively harmful. The bloodletting that you've been trained to perform will only weaken Henry's already compromised immune system. The mercury treatments you're expected to administer are slowly poisoning him. The leeches you apply are introducing even more bacteria into his infected wounds. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of your new position isn't the primitive medicine, or even the constant threat of execution. It's the dawning realization that Henry VIII isn't just physically ill, he's mentally unhinged. The same head injury from that fateful jousting accident in 1536 that damaged his leg also seems to have fundamentally altered his personality. The king, who once wrote theological treatises and composed music, has become a paranoid, violent tyrant whose mood swings are as unpredictable as they are deadly. You watch in horror as Henry's eyes, once described as intelligent and piercing, now dart around the room with barely contained rage. His hands, swollen and ring-heavy, clench and unclench as he speaks, and you notice the way courtiers instinctively step back when he moves. This is a man who has already executed 2 wives, countless nobles, and numerous servants for perceived slights. And now, your life depends on somehow healing a body that is quite literally rotting from the inside out. The king's daily routine becomes your nightmare. Each morning, you must inspect his wounds, pretending that your primitive treatments are actually helping, while secretly knowing that you're probably making everything worse. You watch as servants change his bandages, the cloth coming away soaked in blood and pus, and you're expected to nod sagely and adjust his treatment accordingly. Your medical bag contains implements that would make a modern doctor weep: crude knives for bloodletting that are rarely cleaned, bottles of mercury that you now know are pure poison, and various herbs and tinctures whose effects are based more on superstition than science. Every morning you mix these medieval cocktails of death, knowing that each dose might be the one that finally tips the king over the edge. But it gets worse. Henry doesn't just expect you to treat his physical ailments, he demands that you cure his marital problems as well. The king is desperately trying to produce a male heir with his current wife, Jane Seymour, and when she fails to conceive quickly enough, Henry assumes it must be a medical issue. You're expected to examine the queen, prescribe fertility treatments, and somehow guarantee that she'll bear a son. The pressure is unimaginable, because if Jane fails to produce an heir, Henry will almost certainly blame you for the medical failure before he turns his wrath on his wife. Your days are filled with a constant gnawing terror that never lets up. Every knock on your door could be guards coming to arrest you. Every summons to the king's chambers might be your last. You've seen what happens to those who displease Henry. The executions are public, brutal, and designed to send a message. The king particularly enjoys watching his enemies suffer, and as his doctor, you're in the unique position of being both essential to his survival and completely expendable if you fail to deliver results. This opening establishes the brutal reality of being Henry VIII's doctor, while maintaining the engaging, immersive style of the reference videos. It sets up the medical horrors, political dangers, and psychological terror that would have defined this role, creating a compelling hook that draws viewers into the historical nightmare. Part 2. the medieval medical arsenal. The morning mist still clings to the castle walls as you, Henry's personal physician, make your way through the dimly lit corridors toward the king's chambers. Your leather satchel bounces against your hip, heavy with the tools of your trade. But calling them tools is perhaps too generous. What you carry are the instruments of medieval medicine, each one more terrifying than the last, and none of them capable of truly helping your royal patient. Your fingers trace the cold metal of your phlegm, a sharp blade designed for bloodletting. This will be your most frequently used instrument in treating the king. According to the medical wisdom of your time, Henry's festering leg wound, his mounting rage, and his general ill health all stem from an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The solution, as you've been taught, is to drain the excess blood that's supposedly causing his problems. Never mind that each bloodletting session leaves the already weakened king paler and more irritable than before. You pause outside the royal chambers, steeling yourself for what lies ahead. Through the heavy oak door, you can already hear Henry's laboured breathing and the occasional grunt of pain. At over 300 pounds, the king's massive frame puts tremendous strain on his heart, and the infected ulcer on his leg has been weeping pus for months. The stench that greets you when you enter is overwhelming, a mixture of rotting flesh, unwashed body, and the herb-scented oils that previous physicians have slathered on the wound to no avail. Henry glares at you from his bed, his small eyes nearly lost in the folds of his bloated face. "Well?" he demands, his voice a dangerous growl. "What miracle cure do you bring me today, doctor?" The sarcasm in his voice is unmistakable, born from years of failed treatments and broken promises from physicians before you. You've seen what happened to some of your predecessors. Dr. Butts, who dared to suggest that Henry's diet might be contributing to his problems, was banished from court. Dr. Wendy, who failed to cure a particularly severe bout of headaches, simply disappeared one night, and no one at court speaks of him anymore. You set down your satchel and begin arranging your instruments on a small table beside the king's bed. First, the cupping vessels, small glass or metal bowls that you'll heat and place on Henry's skin to draw blood to the surface. The theory is that this will help rebalance his humours, but in reality, it will only add painful welts to his already suffering body. Next, you lay out your collection of herbs and tinctures. Mercury, for what you believe are signs of the French pox, though you'd never dare voice this diagnosis aloud. Opium mixed with wine to dull his pain, though it also clouds his already unstable mind. And various plant extracts that are more likely to poison than heal. Your surgical tools gleam menacingly in the candlelight. A bone saw, should you need to amputate any part of his rotting leg. Cauterizing irons to burn away infected flesh, a procedure so agonizing that even the king has begged you to stop mid-treatment. Crude forceps for extracting pieces of dead tissue, and a collection of knives sharp enough to cut, but lacking any understanding of anatomy or infection control. The most disturbing tool in your arsenal isn't made of metal at all. In a small wooden box, you keep a collection of live leeches, their black bodies writhing in the damp moss that keeps them alive. These creatures will latch onto Henry's skin with their tiny teeth, gorging themselves on his blood while you watch and pray that this primitive form of bloodletting will somehow restore his health. The sight of dozens of leeches covering the king's swollen leg is something that haunts your dreams, but it's considered the height of medical sophistication in 1538. Perhaps most tragic of all is your complete ignorance of what's actually wrong with your patient. You don't understand that Henry's leg wound is infected with bacteria, organisms too small for you to see or even imagine. You have no concept of germs, no knowledge of antiseptic practices, no understanding of how infection spreads. When you move from examining his festering wound to checking his pulse, you don't think to wash your hands. When you reuse the same instruments on different parts of his body, you're actually spreading the infection you're trying to cure. Your diagnostic methods are based on observation of superficial symptoms and adherence to ancient Greek theories that have no basis in reality. You examine Henry's urine for colour and clarity, believing this will tell you about the state of his humours. You check the alignment of the stars and planets, convinced that celestial movements influence earthly health. You consult charts that match zodiac signs to body parts, determining the best times for treatment based on astrological calculations rather than medical need. The king's psychological state adds another layer of complexity to your impossible task. Years of head injuries from jousting accidents have left Henry with what modern doctors would recognize as traumatic brain injury. His mood swings are violent and unpredictable. One moment he might be praising your efforts. The next, he could be threatening to have you executed for incompetence. You've learned to read the subtle signs of his shifting temper, the way his breathing changes when anger is building, the particular set of his jaw that means someone is about to feel his wrath. But your medieval understanding of the mind is even more primitive than your knowledge of the body. You believe that mental states are controlled by the same humoral imbalances that cause physical ailments. Henry's rage, you think, comes from an excess of yellow bile or choler. His periods of melancholy must be due to too much black bile. The solution, in your mind, is more bloodletting, more purging, more of the same treatments that are slowly killing him. The tools in your bag represent centuries of medical tradition, passed down from master to apprentice without question or innovation. The bloodletting techniques you use are based on the teachings of Galen, a Roman physician who died over 1,000 years before your birth. The herbal remedies you prescribe come from manuscripts copied and recopied by monks who had no medical training. The surgical procedures you perform follow methods developed in an age when human dissection was forbidden, leaving anatomical knowledge based on the examination of animals. As you prepare to begin another day's treatment, you're acutely aware that you're gambling with more than just Henry's health. Your own life hangs in the balance with every decision you make. If the king dies under your care, you could be accused of murder. If he suffers a particularly bad day, you might find yourself in the Tower of London before sunset. The pressure is so intense that your hands sometimes shake as you handle your instruments, and you've developed a nervous habit of constantly checking over your shoulder for guards who might be coming to arrest you. The irony is that the very treatments you're applying with such careful attention to medieval medical theory are making Henry worse. Each bloodletting session weakens his immune system further. The mercury you're giving him for suspected syphilis is slowly poisoning his organs. The unsanitary conditions in which you work are introducing new infections, even as you try to treat existing ones. Your cupping and leeching are causing additional wounds that become infected in their own right. Yet you persist because this is all you know. In your time, there are no medical schools teaching anatomy based on human dissection. There are no hospitals conducting systematic studies of disease. There is no scientific method for testing whether treatments actually work. Medicine is a combination of superstition, tradition, and desperate hope, practiced by men who are often more concerned with protecting their reputations than admitting their ignorance. The weight of this responsibility settles on your shoulders like a heavy cloak as you reach for your phlegm to begin the day's bloodletting. You know that what you're about to do will cause Henry pain and weaken him further, but you also know that failing to treat him, according to accepted medical practice, could cost you your life. You're trapped in a system that demands action even when that action is harmful, serving a patient whose condition is beyond the understanding of your age. In the candlelit chamber, surrounded by the tools of your primitive trade, you represent the tragic intersection of good intentions and dangerous ignorance. You genuinely want to help your king, but every method at your disposal is more likely to harm than heal. This is the brutal reality of being Henry VIII's doctor. You're fighting a losing battle with weapons that were obsolete before you were born. And the price of failure isn't just professional embarrassment, but quite possibly your head on a chopping block. The morning's treatment is about to begin, and somewhere in the depths of the castle, the executioner's axe waits, sharp and ready, for the next physician who fails to cure the incurable king. Based on the reference videos and the script summary provided, here's part 3 of Boring History: Your Brutal Life as Henry VIII's Doctor. But your torment extends far beyond the grotesque wound that festers on Henry's leg. Each day brings new medical crises that would challenge even the most skilled physicians of our modern era. The king suffers from what we now understand to be severe diabetes, though in 1538 you have no concept of blood sugar or insulin. You watch helplessly as Henry experiences wild mood swings, his body bloating to monstrous proportions, his appetite swinging between gluttonous excess and complete revulsion. Your medical bag contains instruments that would horrify any modern doctor. Your bone saw, rusted and dull from countless uses, serves for amputations performed without anesthesia. Your cupping vessels, made of horn and glass, are used to draw what you believe is corrupted blood from Henry's swollen flesh. The king's screams echo through the stone corridors of Whitehall Palace as you apply heated irons to cauterize wounds, believing that burning flesh will somehow purge the evil humours that plague his body. The pressure to cure Henry's infertility weighs heaviest on your shoulders. Each month that passes without Queen Jane Seymour producing a male heir brings you closer to the executioner's block. You prescribe increasingly desperate remedies based on the flawed medical knowledge of your time. Ground unicorn horn, believed to enhance virility, costs more than most people earn in a lifetime. You mix powdered pearls with wine, convinced that their purity will cleanse Henry's seed. When these fail, you turn to even more barbaric treatments, applying leeches to the king's most intimate areas while he roars in pain and fury. Your understanding of anatomy comes from ancient Greek texts that are often wildly inaccurate. You believe the heart has 2 chambers instead of 4, that blood is produced in the liver, and that women are simply defective versions of men. When examining Henry's numerous ailments, you operate under the assumption that his body contains 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness results from their imbalance. This leads you to prescribe treatments that often make Henry sicker rather than better. The king's mental state deteriorates before your eyes, and you are powerless to help. Modern historians suspect Henry suffered from traumatic brain injury from his jousting accident in 1536, just 2 years before your current predicament. You witness his paranoid rages, his sudden shifts from jovial laughter to murderous fury, his increasing inability to form coherent thoughts. But your medieval understanding attributes these symptoms to an excess of choler or perhaps demonic possession. Your treatments involve drilling holes in his skull to release evil spirits, a procedure called trepanation that you perform with crude tools and no understanding of brain function. Sleep offers no respite from your daily horrors. You are summoned at all hours to attend to Henry's various complaints. Sometimes it's his suppurating leg wound, which refuses to heal despite your daily applications of honey, pig fat, and ground herbs. Other times it's his chronic headaches, which you treat by applying heated cups to his scalp, creating painful blisters that you believe will draw out the corrupt humours. On the worst nights, you're called to witness Henry's fits of rage, where he threatens to have you hanged, drawn, and quartered for your failures as a physician. Your surgical procedures are primitive beyond imagination. When Henry requires surgery for an abscess, you have no understanding of sterile technique. Your instruments are cleaned with wine if you're feeling particularly cautious, but more often, they're simply wiped on your already filthy robes. You operate by candlelight in rooms thick with smoke and the stench of unwashed bodies. Infection is not a complication you can prevent. It's an inevitability you simply hope the patient will survive. The pharmaceutical remedies at your disposal are equally horrifying. Your medicine chest contains vials of mercury, which you believe can cure syphilis, but which actually causes severe neurological damage. You prescribe antimony, a toxic metal, for various ailments, watching as patients develop violent vomiting and diarrhea that you interpret as the body purging itself of disease. Your pain remedies include opium when you can obtain it, but more often you rely on alcohol or simply tell patients to pray for divine intervention. Henry's diet, which you are expected to regulate for his health, consists of massive quantities of meat, white bread, and ale. Vegetables are considered peasant food and potentially dangerous to a king's delicate constitution. You watch Henry consume pounds of roasted beef, whole chickens, and elaborate sugar sculptures, while his body grows ever more diseased and bloated. When he complains of digestive problems, you prescribe more meat and wine, believing that rich foods will strengthen his constitution. Your knowledge of contagion is non-existent, making you a vector for disease rather than a healer. You move directly from treating plague victims to examining the king without washing your hands or changing your clothes. You believe that disease is caused by bad air or divine punishment, not by invisible organisms that can be transmitted through contact. This ignorance makes you incredibly dangerous to Henry's health, even as you desperately try to cure him. The weight of your position crushes down upon you every moment of every day. You know that Henry has already executed Thomas More, his former chancellor and close friend. You've watched Bishop Fisher's head roll for opposing the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Thomas Cromwell, once Henry's most trusted advisor, was beheaded just 2 years ago. If these powerful men couldn't escape Henry's wrath, what chance do you have as a mere physician who cannot cure what ails him? Your greatest fear is not just death, but the manner of your death. Henry delights in creative executions for those who disappoint him. You might be burned alive for heresy if you suggest that God doesn't want Henry to have a son. You could be hanged, drawn, and quartered for treason if you fail to cure his impotence. Or you might simply disappear one night, your body thrown into the Thames like so many others who have fallen from royal favour. Every morning you wake knowing that this could be your last day alive. Every treatment you prescribe could be the one that finally pushes Henry over the edge into murderous rage. Every failure to ease his pain brings you closer to joining the growing list of those who have tried and failed to serve the most dangerous monarch in English history. You are trapped in a nightmare of ignorance, brutality, and terror, with no escape except death itself. You're Henry VIII's personal physician in 1538, and the weight of your impossible position crushes down like a stone slab. The king's health deteriorates daily. His leg wound festers, oozing pus, and filling the royal chambers with the stench of rotting flesh. His mood swings grow more violent, his paranoia deeper. Yesterday he screamed at you for an hour about imagined conspiracies, spittle flying from his lips as he accused you of poisoning him with your worthless remedies. Your medical arsenal is laughably primitive. You clutch your worn leather bag containing your tools of the trade, rusted lancets for bloodletting, a collection of writhing leeches in a clay pot, and vials of mercury that you know burns the throat, but are told purifies the blood. The four humours theory guides your every decision. You must balance Henry's blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, though you secretly suspect this ancient wisdom kills more than it cures. The ulcer on Henry's leg has grown to the size of a man's fist. The flesh around it has turned a sickly green-black, and you can smell the corruption from across the room. You've tried everything, applying honey and herbs, draining the wound with heated cups, even boring small holes in his skull to release the evil vapors causing his headaches. Nothing works. The infection spreads like a slow poison through his massive frame. Your hands shake as you prepare another mercury treatment, knowing it will likely make him sicker. But what choice do you have? The king demands action, and to do nothing is to invite accusations of treason. You've watched 3 physicians before you lose their heads for failing their sovereign. Their blood still stains the tower's stones. The irony burns like acid. Your treatments often worsen his condition. The bloodletting weakens him when he needs strength. The mercury causes violent vomiting and loosens his teeth. The trepanation you performed last month to release pressure from his skull only gave him blinding headaches. Yet you must continue this charade of healing, pretending your medieval medicine can cure what you cannot even properly diagnose. Henry's paranoia has reached new heights. He sees poison in every meal, conspiracy in every whisper. Last week, he had 2 kitchen servants executed because his stomach ached after dinner. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, now dart about wildly, searching for threats that exist only in his diseased mind. You wonder if the infection has reached his brain, or if the constant pain has simply driven him mad. The political danger suffocates you like a heavy cloak. One wrong word, one failed treatment, one honest assessment of his condition could seal your fate. When Henry roars in pain during your treatments, you must bite your tongue to keep from crying out yourself. When he demands to know why he's not improving, you craft careful lies about stubborn humours and rebellious blood, while inside you scream the truth, that you're a butcher masquerading as a healer. Sleep brings no peace. Your dreams are haunted by the faces of your predecessors, their severed heads mounted on spikes above London Bridge. You wake in cold sweats, touching your own neck to ensure it's still attached. Your wife begs you to flee the court, to find some remote village where you might practice simple medicine in peace. But Henry's physicians don't retire. They serve until death, his or theirs. The corruption extends beyond the king's body into the very heart of the medical profession. You've watched fellow physicians prescribe ground unicorn horn and powdered mummy, charging enormous sums for worthless remedies. The apothecaries sell miracle cures made from nothing but coloured water and sheep's dung. Meanwhile, the real healers, the wise women with their herbal knowledge, the barber surgeons with their practical skills, are dismissed as quacks while you learned men kill with your ignorance. Today you must inform Henry that his condition is worsening. His leg wound shows signs of gangrene, though you cannot speak that word aloud. Instead, you'll talk of corrupted humours requiring stronger purging and recommend more bloodletting, more mercury, more suffering. You'll watch his face contort with rage and pain, knowing that in his twisted mind, your inability to heal him makes you complicit in some imagined plot against the crown. The room spins as you consider your options. Tell the truth and face immediate execution for defeatist thinking. Continue the charade and watch him slowly die while he takes his rage out on you daily, or attempt some desperate experimental treatment that might kill him instantly and ensure your own head decorates a spike by sunset. Every choice leads to death, his or yours, perhaps both. You think of the great physicians of antiquity, of Galen and Hippocrates, whose theories you follow blindly despite their obvious failures. Do no harm, Hippocrates taught, yet every day you cause agony with your treatments. You wonder if future physicians will look back on your era with the same horror you feel when contemplating the brutal methods of battlefield surgeons. The king's bell rings, summoning you to another session of futile torture disguised as medicine. You gather your instruments of ignorance and walk toward the royal chambers, each step bringing you closer to another day of impossible choices. In your wake, you leave drops of blood from your own bitten tongue, the only honest medicine you've drawn in months. By 1540, your daily routine as Henry's physician has become a nightmare of medical uncertainty and political survival. Each morning brings fresh horrors as you examine the king's festering leg wound, now so putrid that courtiers can smell the rot from across the chamber. The ulcer, likely caused by a riding accident years earlier, has become a grotesque crater of infected flesh that refuses to heal. You apply poultices of honey and ground pearls, treatments that cost more than most subjects earn in a lifetime, yet the wound only grows more foul with each passing day. The king's rage has become as unpredictable as his health. One moment he's demanding you increase his daily dose of mercury to cure his suspected syphilis. The next, he's threatening to have you executed for the very treatments he commanded. The mercury, which you know is slowly poisoning him, causes his teeth to loosen and fall out, his gums to bleed constantly, and his hands to shake uncontrollably. Yet when you hesitantly suggest reducing the dose, Henry flies into such a fury that you quickly retreat, knowing that questioning the king's medical judgment could mean your death. Your treatment arsenal is a collection of medieval horrors that would be considered torture by any reasonable standard. Bloodletting has become a daily ritual, with the leeches covering Henry's bloated body like living jewels. You drain pints of blood from his veins, believing it will balance his humours, but each session leaves him weaker and more irritable. The cupping glasses leave angry red welts across his skin, and the scarification wounds from your crude lancets frequently become infected themselves, adding new sources of poison to his already compromised system. The surgical procedures you perform are conducted without any understanding of infection or proper sterilization. Your instruments, crude iron tools that haven't been properly cleaned since your last patient, slice through royal flesh with the same contamination they've carried from treating plague victims and common criminals. When Henry demands you lance a particularly angry boil on his thigh, you use the same knife you employed that morning to treat a scrofulous beggar, unwittingly introducing new bacteria into the king's bloodstream. Henry's mental state deteriorates alongside his physical health, and you suspect the head injuries from his numerous jousting accidents have damaged his brain in ways you cannot comprehend. He suffers from what you can only describe as fits of madness, where he becomes convinced that his food is poisoned or that his courtiers are plotting against him. During these episodes, he demands you taste everything he consumes, making you an unwilling food tester whose life depends on the kitchen staff's competence and loyalty. The king's paranoia extends to his medical treatment, and he frequently accuses you of deliberately prolonging his suffering to maintain your position at court. He demands explanations for why his ailments persist, despite your expensive remedies, and you're forced to craft elaborate lies about the slow-working nature of your treatments. You blame his continued suffering on everything from evil humours to divine punishment for his sins, all while knowing that your treatments are likely making him worse rather than better. Your attempts to treat Henry's chronic constipation, caused partly by his poor diet and partly by his mercury poisoning, involve administering violent purgatives that leave him writhing in agony for hours. The king demands these treatments despite their obvious harmful effects, believing that expelling waste from his body will somehow purify his royal blood. You prepare mixtures of wormwood, rhubarb, and antimony that cause such violent intestinal spasms that Henry sometimes loses consciousness from the pain. The infection in Henry's leg wound has begun to affect his entire body, and you notice the telltale signs of septicemia beginning to manifest. His skin takes on a greyish pallor, his breathing becomes laboured, and his body temperature fluctuates wildly between burning fever and bone-chilling cold. Yet when you suggest that the wound might require amputation, Henry threatens to have you drawn and quartered for even suggesting such a mutilation of the royal person. Your knowledge of anatomy is based entirely on the flawed teachings of ancient Greek physicians who were forbidden from dissecting human bodies. You believe that Henry's illnesses are caused by an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This leads you to prescribe treatments that attempt to restore balance through increasingly dangerous means. You administer powerful emetics to make him vomit, believing this will expel excess yellow bile and force him to consume bitter herbs that you think will counteract an overabundance of blood. The king's obesity, now reaching truly dangerous proportions, creates additional medical challenges that you're completely unequipped to handle. His massive weight puts enormous strain on his heart and lungs, causing him to wheeze and gasp for breath after even minor exertion. You attempt to treat this by binding his chest tightly with linen strips, believing this will help his lungs function better. But the compression only makes his breathing more difficult and adds to his discomfort. Henry's demand for an heir drives you to prescribe increasingly desperate fertility treatments that border on the absurd. You prepare potions containing ground rhinoceros horn, powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, and various exotic herbs that cost the royal treasury enormous sums. The king consumes these concoctions religiously, believing they will restore his virility and ensure the continuation of the Tudor dynasty, while you secretly doubt their effectiveness. The pressure to maintain Henry's sexual performance leads you into the dangerous territory of treating what would now be recognized as erectile dysfunction. You prepare stimulating ointments containing Spanish fly and other dangerous substances that cause painful inflammation and sometimes lasting damage. The king's frustration with these failures often results in violent outbursts directed at you, and you live in constant fear that one day his disappointment will prove fatal to your career and your life. Your position becomes even more precarious as Henry begins consulting other physicians and quacks, each promising miracle cures that you know are impossible. You're forced to compete with charlatans who claim they can restore the king's youth, cure his syphilis overnight, or guarantee him a male heir. When these competitors inevitably fail, Henry sometimes blames you for not warning him strongly enough against their treatments, creating a no-win situation where any advice you give can be used against you. The political implications of Henry's failing health create additional dangers for you as his physician. Court factions begin positioning themselves for the succession, and your medical opinions about the king's prognosis could be seen as treasonous predictions about his death. You're forced to maintain the fiction that Henry will recover fully, while privately knowing that his multiple ailments are likely to prove fatal. Any hint that you doubt the king's eventual recovery could be interpreted as wishing for his death, a crime punishable by the most brutal execution methods available. The constant stress of your position begins to affect your own health, and you suffer from chronic insomnia, digestive problems, and what would now be recognized as severe anxiety. You turn to the same useless remedies you prescribe for others, drinking wine mixed with ground gold and taking daily doses of theriac, a supposed universal antidote that contains dozens of exotic ingredients, including viper's flesh and opium. These treatments provide no real relief, but give you the illusion of taking some control over your deteriorating situation. As Henry's condition continues to worsen, you realize that your medical knowledge is not just inadequate, but actively harmful. Yet you're trapped in a system where admitting ignorance would mean certain death, and where the king's absolute authority extends even to determining what constitutes proper medical treatment. You continue your futile efforts to heal an unhealable patient, knowing that each day brings you closer to either the king's death or your own execution for failing to prevent it. Boring history. Your brutal life as Henry VIII's doctor. Part 6. By early 1539, the royal physicians faced an increasingly desperate situation. Henry's leg wound had become a festering nightmare that defied every remedy in their medieval arsenal. The ulcer now measured nearly 6 inches across, weeping constantly through layers of bandages that had to be changed multiple times daily. The stench was so overwhelming that courtiers would cover their noses with perfumed handkerchiefs when approaching the king. Yet this putrid crater in Henry's flesh was merely the most visible symptom of a body in complete systemic collapse. Dr. William Butts, the king's primary physician, had watched helplessly as his patient's condition deteriorated beyond anything described in the ancient medical texts. The humoral theory that governed all medieval medicine suggested that Henry's choleric temperament had become dangerously imbalanced. producing excess yellow bile that manifested as both the leg wound and his increasingly violent mood swings. According to Galenic doctrine, the solution should have been straightforward. Purge the excess bile through bloodletting, induce vomiting with emetics, and apply cooling treatments to restore balance. But every intervention seemed to make Henry worse. The bloodletting sessions had become particularly harrowing ordeals. Where once the king might have submitted to having a pint of blood drawn, he now required multiple procedures weekly. Dr. Butts would make careful incisions in Henry's arms with his brass fleam, watching as thick, dark blood flowed into pewter bowls. The blood often appeared almost black, which medieval physicians interpreted as evidence of severe corruption in the humours. Sometimes clots would form immediately, suggesting that the blood itself was diseased. Yet rather than providing relief, these bloodlettings left Henry weaker and more irascible than before. The application of leeches had become an almost daily ritual. Dr. Butts would carefully select the fattest specimens from his collection, placing them around the edges of Henry's leg wound and on his temples to draw out the poisoned humours. The creatures would gorge themselves on the king's blood until they were swollen to 3 times their normal size, then drop off, leaving behind small bleeding punctures. Henry would lie still during these treatments, his massive frame trembling occasionally as the leeches did their work. But instead of the promised relief, the king often emerged from these sessions pale and dizzy, his wound no better than before. Mercury treatments had become increasingly frequent and aggressive. The liquid metal was believed to have purifying properties that could cleanse the body of corruption from within. Dr. Butts would carefully measure doses of mercury into wine or mix it with honey to make it more palatable, though Henry often complained bitterly about the metallic taste that lingered for days. The mercury would cause violent purging from both ends, leaving the king retching and cramping for hours. His gums became inflamed and his teeth loose from mercury poisoning, though the physicians interpreted these symptoms as evidence that the treatment was working to expel toxins. The king's diet had been drastically altered according to medical theory. Foods considered hot and dry, such as meat and wine, were believed to exacerbate his choleric condition. Instead, Dr. Butts prescribed cooling foods like fish, vegetables, and diluted ales. But Henry, accustomed to consuming massive quantities of roasted meats, rich sauces, and strong wines, fought these dietary restrictions constantly. He would fly into rages when presented with what he called peasant food, sometimes hurling dishes across his chambers and threatening to have the physicians executed for trying to starve him. The wound care itself had become a nightmare of medieval medical practice. Multiple times daily, Dr. Butts and his assistants would remove the soiled bandages, revealing the angry weeping crater that dominated Henry's left leg. They would flush the wound with various solutions, wine mixed with herbs, rose water, even solutions containing ground pearls and gold, which were believed to have healing properties. The flesh around the wound had become swollen and discolored, with angry red streaks extending up toward Henry's knee. Sometimes the physicians would insert drainage tubes made of silver or lead to allow the corruption to flow out, a procedure that caused Henry to roar in pain despite his attempts to maintain royal dignity. Cauterization with red-hot irons had been attempted several times, with Dr. Butts heating iron rods in braziers until they glowed orange, then pressing them against the infected tissue. The smell of burning flesh would fill the royal chambers as Henry gripped the arms of his chair, sweat pouring down his face. These procedures were supposed to burn away the corruption and stimulate healing, but they only seemed to make the wound larger and more painful. The scar tissue that formed would invariably break down within days, leaving the wound even worse than before. Herbal treatments had been applied in every conceivable combination. Poultices made from comfrey, plantain, and yarrow were applied to promote healing. Tinctures of echinacea and willow bark were administered for their supposed anti-inflammatory properties. Exotic ingredients were imported at enormous expense. unicorn horn powder from distant lands, bezoar stones from the stomachs of wild goats, even ground mummy from Egyptian tombs. These remedies, costing more than most people earned in a lifetime, showed no more effectiveness than common herbs. The king's sleep had become increasingly disturbed. The constant pain from his leg made it impossible for him to find a comfortable position. Dr. Butts would prepare sleeping draughts from opium poppies, valerian root, and mandrake, but these only provided temporary relief and often left Henry groggy and confused the next day. The royal bedchamber reeked of infection and decay, despite constant efforts to mask the smell with burning incense and scattered rose petals. Henry would often wake in the middle of the night, bellowing for his physicians to do something about the pain that shot through his leg like fire. The king's mental state had become as concerning as his physical condition. Always prone to suspicion and paranoia, Henry now saw treachery in every shadow. He became convinced that his physicians were deliberately prolonging his suffering, perhaps in league with his enemies. Dr. Butts found himself walking an increasingly narrow tightrope, trying to provide medical care while avoiding any action that might be interpreted as treasonous. The king would sometimes accuse his doctors of poisoning him, then in the next breath demand stronger treatments to cure his ailments. Attempts at exercise and movement, once part of Henry's treatment regimen, had become impossible. The king, who had once been an accomplished athlete, skilled at jousting, hunting, and dancing, could now barely walk across his chambers without assistance. His enormous weight, estimated at well over 300 pounds, combined with the agony from his leg, made any physical activity an ordeal. Dr. Butts would sometimes suggest gentle movement to improve circulation, but Henry would erupt in fury at the suggestion, claiming his physicians were trying to torture him. The court atmosphere had become increasingly tense as Henry's condition worsened. Courtiers would gather in corners, whispering about the king's health and speculating about succession. Dr. Butts knew that every conversation he had was being watched and analysed for signs of disloyalty. The wrong word, the wrong expression, even the wrong tone of voice could be interpreted as evidence of treason. Several physicians had already been dismissed or executed for failing to cure the king, and Dr. Butts lived with the constant knowledge that he could be next. Religious treatments had been added to the medical regimen, as Henry's condition showed no improvement. Priests would be summoned to perform blessings over the king's leg, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers for healing. Relics would be brought from various churches and pressed against the wound, including pieces of the true cross and bones of various saints. Henry, despite his break with Rome, still believed in the healing power of religious artifacts and would sometimes demand that specific relics be brought to him immediately. The cost of Henry's medical care had become astronomical. Exotic ingredients, imported physicians, and constant experimentation with new treatments were draining the royal treasury. Dr. Butts would sometimes receive requests for treatments so expensive that they would bankrupt lesser kingdoms, yet he dared not refuse for fear of being accused of inadequate care. The king's demands for instant relief led to increasingly desperate and expensive attempts at cures, none of which showed any lasting benefit. As winter approached in 1539, Dr. Butts began to recognize the signs of systemic infection that medieval medicine was powerless to address. Henry would experience sudden fevers that would spike without warning, leaving him delirious and rambling. His skin would flush red, then turn pale and clammy as the fever broke. These episodes were becoming more frequent and more severe, suggesting that the infection from his leg was spreading throughout his body. Yet Dr. Butts had no understanding of bacteria or the concept of septicemia that was slowly killing his patient. The king's appetite, once legendary in its excess, had become erratic and strange. Sometimes he would refuse all food for days, claiming everything tasted like poison. Other times, he would demand enormous quantities of specific foods, eating until he made himself sick. Dr. Butts tried to regulate the royal diet according to humoral theory, but Henry's increasingly irrational demands made consistent treatment impossible. The king would sometimes accuse his food tasters of conspiring against him, leading to a constant turnover in kitchen staff. Attempts at trepanation, the medieval practice of drilling holes in the skull to release evil humours, had been discussed as a potential treatment for Henry's headaches and mood swings. Dr. Butts had the necessary tools: sharp-pointed trepans that could bore through bone, and saws for removing larger sections of skull. The procedure was believed to relieve pressure on the brain and allow corrupted humours to escape. However, even in an age of brutal medical practices, the idea of drilling holes in the king's head was considered extremely risky, and Dr. Butts had so far resisted Henry's occasional demands for this treatment. The royal physicians had begun consulting with astrologers and alchemists in their desperation to find a cure. Medieval medicine held that the positions of planets and stars could influence human health, and charts were drawn up to determine the most auspicious times for various treatments. Mercury was administered when that planet was in ascendancy, bloodletting was performed when Mars was dominant, and herbal treatments were timed according to lunar phases. These consultations added another layer of complexity to an already confused medical regimen, and Dr. Butts often found himself trying to balance contradictory advice from different specialists. The psychological toll on the royal physicians had become severe. Dr. Butts and his colleagues lived in constant fear of Henry's wrath, knowing that their failure to cure the king could result in imprisonment, torture, or execution. They had witnessed the fate of previous physicians who had fallen from favour, and this knowledge coloured every decision they made. Sleep became elusive as they worried about their patient's condition and their own safety. Some physicians had already fled the court, claiming family emergencies or urgent business elsewhere, rather than risk Henry's displeasure. By the end of 1539, it had become clear to Dr. Butts that his patient was dying, though he dared not voice this opinion. The combination of chronic infection, obesity, probable diabetes, and the toxic effects of mercury poisoning had created a medical crisis that was beyond the capabilities of medieval medicine to address. Yet he continued to apply the treatments prescribed by ancient authorities, knowing they were useless but having no alternatives. The king's body was slowly shutting down, poisoned by the very treatments meant to heal him, while his physicians watched helplessly and prayed they would not be blamed for their inevitable failure. The isolation of the royal physicians had become complete. They could trust no one at court, as any conversation might be reported to the king and interpreted as evidence of conspiracy. They lived like prisoners in the palace, their every move watched and analysed. Dr. Butts had begun to understand that he was not really a physician in any meaningful sense, but rather a performer in an elaborate charade designed to maintain the illusion that the king could be cured. His medical knowledge, such as it was, had become secondary to his ability to appear confident and reassuring, while administering treatments he knew to be worthless. As Henry VIII's condition continued to deteriorate into the winter of 1539, Dr. Butts faced the horrible realization that he was presiding over the slow death of the most powerful man in England, armed with nothing but medieval superstition and deadly ignorance, while his own life hung in the balance with every failed treatment and every worsening symptom. Your life as Henry VIII's doctor just took another devastating turn. The treatments you've desperately employed, the bloodletting, the mercury, the leeches, have not only failed to heal the king, but they may have made him worse. His leg wound continues to fester, a putrid black crater that fills the royal chambers with the stench of rotting flesh. The mercury you've administered for his suspected syphilis has left him with trembling hands and blackened teeth, his speech sometimes slurred and incomprehensible, and his mood swings have become so violent that even his closest advisors flee when they see the rage building in his bloodshot eyes. You stand in your cramped quarters, surrounded by the tools of your trade, crude surgical instruments, bottles of mysterious powders, and charts showing the supposed alignment of the stars. Your hands shake as you prepare another concoction, knowing full well that each remedy you attempt could be your last. The king's condition is deteriorating rapidly, and with it, your chances of survival. In Tudor England, failure to cure the monarch isn't just professional embarrassment, it's a death sentence. The palace corridors buzz with whispered conversations about the king's declining health. Courtiers exchange nervous glances, knowing that when Henry dies, heads will roll. And yours, as his personal physician, will likely be among the first. You've seen what happened to your predecessors, some dismissed in disgrace, others executed for their perceived incompetence. Dr. William Butts, who served before you, died under mysterious circumstances after repeatedly failing to cure the king's ailments. His replacement lasted barely 6 months before Henry had him thrown in the Tower. Your knowledge of medicine, such as it is, comes from ancient texts written by Greek and Roman physicians who understood little about the human body. You believe that illness stems from an imbalance of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that treatment involves restoring this balance through often brutal methods. When the king complains of headaches, you drill holes in his skull to release the evil vapours trapped inside. When he suffers from digestive problems, you purge his bowels with violent laxatives that leave him weak and dehydrated. When his leg wound refuses to heal, you apply poultices made from ground pearls and unicorn horn, believing these magical substances will draw out the infection. But deep down, you know you're fighting a losing battle. The king's leg wound, likely caused by a jousting accident years earlier, has become a chronic ulcer that will never properly heal. The injury has damaged blood vessels and nerves, creating a perfect breeding ground for bacteria that your primitive understanding of medicine cannot combat. Each time you clean the wound, you inadvertently introduce new infections with your unwashed hands and contaminated instruments. The bandages you apply, made from dirty cloth, only make matters worse. Henry's weight has ballooned to over 300 pounds, making him a walking health catastrophe. His massive frame puts enormous strain on his heart, while his sedentary lifestyle and rich diet have likely given him diabetes. His mood swings and increasingly erratic behavior suggest possible brain damage from repeated head injuries sustained during his younger years as a tournament champion. You suspect he may also be suffering from syphilis, a disease that slowly destroys the mind and body over decades. The mercury treatments you've prescribed for this suspected syphilis are slowly poisoning him. Mercury was believed to cure the disease, but in reality, it causes its own set of horrific symptoms: tremors, memory loss, kidney damage, and eventual death. You watch helplessly as the king's teeth turn black and fall out, his hands shake uncontrollably, and his mind becomes increasingly unstable. The very treatment meant to save him is killing him faster than the disease itself. Your position at court is precarious in the extreme. Henry has already executed 2 wives and countless advisors who displeased him. His paranoia grows worse each day, fueled by pain, illness, and the mercury coursing through his system. He sees enemies everywhere, convinced that his physicians are either incompetent or actively trying to poison him. Sometimes he's not wrong. Several of your colleagues have indeed considered ending his suffering through more direct means, knowing that his death might be the only thing that saves the kingdom from his increasingly tyrannical rule. The pressure to produce results is overwhelming. Every morning you're summoned to examine the king and provide updates on his condition. You must carefully craft your words, offering hope without making promises you cannot keep. Too optimistic, and you'll be blamed when the treatments fail. Too pessimistic, and you'll be accused of defeatism or worse, treason. You've learned to speak in carefully measured phrases, always leaving yourself an escape route while maintaining the illusion that recovery is possible. Your fellow physicians are no help. They're too busy protecting their own positions to offer genuine assistance. Medical knowledge is hoarded like treasure, with each doctor guarding his secrets jealously. There's no collaboration, no sharing of information that might actually help the patient. Instead, you're all engaged in a deadly competition to see who can cure the incurable king, knowing that failure means death while success brings unimaginable rewards. The treatments you employ would be considered torture by modern standards. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, is performed without anesthesia, leaving patients screaming in agony as you bore through bone and brain tissue. Bloodletting involves opening veins and allowing pints of blood to drain out, often leaving patients weak and anemic. The leeches you apply to draw out bad blood often introduce infections of their own, while the mercury you prescribe slowly destroys organs and nervous systems. Your surgical instruments are crude and unsanitized. Rusty knives, dirty saws, and primitive forceps that do more harm than good. There's no understanding of infection or the importance of cleanliness. You operate with the same hands you use to handle decomposing corpses, examine diseased animals, and empty chamber pots. Cross-contamination is inevitable, and many patients die not from their original ailments, but from infections introduced during treatment. The king's daily routine has become a nightmare of medical interventions. Each morning begins with an examination of his leg wound, which requires removing layers of bloody, pus-soaked bandages. The smell is overwhelming. A combination of rotting flesh, infected blood, and the various poultices and ointments you've applied. Henry often screams in pain during these sessions, his massive frame shaking the entire bed as you probe the wound with dirty instruments. After cleaning and redressing the wound, you must attend to his other ailments. His headaches require the application of leeches to his temples, their black bodies swelling with royal blood as they supposedly draw out the toxins causing his pain. His digestive problems necessitate the administration of violent purgatives that leave him doubled over in agony, evacuating his bowels with explosive force. His suspected syphilis demands regular doses of mercury, administered either orally or rubbed into his skin, slowly poisoning him with each treatment. The psychological toll of treating Henry is immense. You must maintain a facade of confidence and competence while knowing that you're essentially helpless. Each failed treatment chips away at your credibility and brings you closer to the executioner's block. You lie awake at night, wondering if tomorrow will be the day Henry finally loses patience with your inability to cure him. You've prepared multiple escape plans, knowing that your life depends on being able to flee at a moment's notice. Your relationship with the other members of Henry's medical team is fraught with tension and suspicion. Everyone is looking for someone to blame when the inevitable happens. Dr. Thomas Wendy eyes you suspiciously during consultations, clearly hoping to position himself as your replacement. Dr. George Owen whispers to courtiers about your unconventional methods, undermining your credibility at every turn. Dr. John Chamber, the eldest of the group, simply tries to avoid responsibility altogether, deflecting blame onto younger, less experienced physicians like yourself. The king's wives and courtiers add another layer of complexity to your impossible situation. Each faction has its own theories about what's wrong with Henry and how he should be treated. Some blame witchcraft and demand that you find and punish the sorcerers responsible for his illness. Others insist that his problems are divine punishment for his break with Rome, and that only spiritual remedies will work. Still, others push for increasingly extreme medical interventions, convinced that more dramatic treatments will succeed where gentle approaches have failed. Your medical training, such as it was, consisted mainly of memorizing ancient texts and learning to identify various herbs and minerals. There was no systematic study of anatomy. Dissection of human corpses was forbidden, leaving you with only rudimentary knowledge of how the body actually works. Your understanding of disease comes from the theory of the four humours, a system so fundamentally flawed that it actively hinders effective treatment. You believe that illness results from imbalances between blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, and that restoring balance requires removing excess humours through bleeding, purging, and vomiting. The tools of your trade reflect the primitive state of medical knowledge. Your surgical instruments are crude iron implements that rust easily and hold edges poorly. Your medicines consist mainly of herbs, minerals, and animal parts ground into powders or boiled into tinctures. You have bottles of mercury for treating syphilis, antimony for inducing vomiting, and opium for managing pain. Most of these substances are more likely to harm than help, but they represent the cutting edge of medical technology in your era. Your diagnostic methods are equally primitive. You examine the king's urine for colour, smell, and taste, believing that these characteristics reveal the state of his internal humours. You check his pulse and feel for swellings, but you have no understanding of blood pressure, heart disease, or the circulatory system. You study his astrological chart to determine the most auspicious times for treatment, convinced that the position of planets and stars affects the outcome of medical interventions. The king's leg wound has become the focus of increasingly desperate treatments. You've tried everything from applying gold leaf to the infected area to packing it with precious stones, believing that these valuable materials possess healing properties. You've used heated irons to cauterize the wound, burning away infected tissue, but also destroying healthy flesh in the process. You've applied poultices made from exotic ingredients, ground unicorn horn, powdered mummy, and essence of dragon's blood, all expensive placebos that do nothing to address the underlying infection. Your knowledge of anatomy is so limited that you don't understand why the wound won't heal. You don't know about bacteria, blood circulation, or the immune system. You can't recognize that the king's diabetes is preventing proper healing, or that his obesity is putting enormous strain on his cardiovascular system. You're treating symptoms without understanding their causes, like trying to fix a broken clock by polishing its face. The mercury treatments for Henry's suspected syphilis are slowly destroying his nervous system. You watch as his hands develop an increasingly pronounced tremor. His speech becomes slurred, and his memory deteriorates. His teeth are turning black and falling out. His breath smells of metal, and his kidneys are failing. But you continue the treatments because mercury is the accepted cure for syphilis, and abandoning it would be seen as giving up on the king's recovery. Your position requires you to maintain detailed records of all treatments and their effects. These documents serve multiple purposes. They track the progression of the king's illness, justify your therapeutic choices, and potentially provide evidence of your competence if questions arise about your performance. But they also create a paper trail that could be used against you if Henry dies and someone needs to be blamed for his death. The political implications of Henry's declining health are never far from your mind. His potential death could trigger a succession crisis, civil war, or foreign invasion. Various factions at court are already maneuvering for position, and your medical assessments could influence their strategies. You must be careful not to reveal too much about the king's true condition, as this information could be used by his enemies to plan rebellions or invasions. Your family lives in constant fear for your safety. They know that your position, while prestigious and well compensated, is also extremely dangerous. Your wife has prepared to flee the country at a moment's notice, and your children have been instructed never to mention your work to outsiders. The entire household exists under a cloud of anxiety, knowing that their fate is tied to your success in treating an essentially untreatable patient. The ethical dilemmas you face are crushing. You know that many of your treatments are harmful, but abandoning them would be seen as giving up on the king. You're caught between your duty to do no harm and the political necessity of being seen to do something. Sometimes you wonder if the kindest thing would be to allow Henry to die naturally, but such thoughts border on treason and could get you executed even for thinking them. Your sleep is haunted by nightmares of failure and execution. You dream of standing on the scaffold, feeling the rough hemp rope around your neck as the crowd bays for your blood. You wake in cold sweats, your heart pounding as you realize that these dreams may soon become reality. The stress is taking a physical toll. You've lost weight, developed tremors in your own hands, and begun suffering from the same digestive problems that plague your royal patient. The isolation of your position is perhaps the worst part. You can't confide in anyone about your fears or doubts. Your colleagues are rivals who would happily see you fail. The courtiers view you with suspicion and fear, knowing that you possess intimate knowledge of the king's declining health. Your family tries to be supportive, but they can't truly understand the pressures you face. You are utterly alone with your impossible task, and your growing certainty that you will not survive its completion. Each day brings new evidence of your impending doom. The king's condition continues to deteriorate despite your best efforts. His leg wound grows larger and more putrid. His mental state becomes increasingly unstable. His physical strength ebbs away as the various toxins you've administered take their toll. You are watching him die slowly, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. Your only hope now is that when the end comes, it will be quick, for both of you. Boring history. Your brutal life as Henry VIII's Doctor, Part 8. By 1540, you have witnessed the king's descent into madness firsthand. The mercury treatments, meant to cure his pox, have poisoned his mind beyond repair. His mood swings are violent and unpredictable. One moment he speaks lovingly of his late wife, Jane Seymour. The next he screams about phantom conspiracies against him. His paranoia has reached such heights that he sees enemies in every shadow, traitors in every whisper. You must tread more carefully than ever before, knowing that a single misdiagnosed symptom or failed treatment could be your last. The ulcer on his leg has now grown to the size of a man's fist. The putrid smell emanating from the wound is so overwhelming that courtiers hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses when approaching the king. You have tried every remedy known to medieval medicine. Hot irons to cauterize the flesh, maggots to eat away the dead tissue, poultices made from crushed pearls and unicorn horn powder. Nothing works. The infection has spread deep into the bone, and you suspect it has entered his bloodstream. His fever comes and goes in waves, leaving him delirious and babbling about his enemies plotting against him. Your fellow physicians whisper among themselves about the king's deteriorating mental state. Some believe the devil himself has possessed Henry's body. Others think God is punishing him for his many sins. You know better. The mercury you have been feeding him for years has slowly destroyed his brain. The metal has accumulated in his tissues, causing tremors, memory loss, and violent outbursts. But you dare not speak this truth aloud. To suggest that your treatments have harmed the king would be tantamount to signing your own death warrant. The court has become a place of constant terror. Henry's sixth wife, Catherine Parr, walks on eggshells around her husband. She has learned from the fates of her predecessors. Anne Boleyn, beheaded for alleged adultery. Catherine Howard, executed for her past indiscretions. Catherine of Aragon, divorced and exiled. The king's marriage bed has become a graveyard of broken women, and you wonder how long this latest Catherine will survive his paranoid rage. Your days are filled with increasingly desperate attempts to heal an unhealable man. You bleed him daily, watching pints of his royal blood drain into silver bowls. His body has become so weak from these bloodlettings that he can barely stand without assistance. Yet you continue, because to stop would be to admit defeat, and defeat is not an option when treating the King of England. You prepare elaborate concoctions of rare herbs and exotic ingredients: powdered rhinoceros horn from Africa, bezoar stones from Persian goats, ambergris from the bellies of whales. Each ingredient costs more than most people see in a lifetime, yet they provide no relief to the king's suffering. The trepanation you performed months ago has left Henry with terrible headaches. The hole in his skull, meant to release evil humours, has instead allowed infection to enter his brain. You watch helplessly as his cognitive abilities deteriorate day by day. He forgets the names of longtime courtiers. He issues contradictory orders within the span of minutes. He sometimes fails to recognize his own reflection in mirrors, flying into rages at the stranger staring back at him. Your surgical instruments have become tools of torture rather than healing. The bone saws used to cut away infected tissue, the red-hot cauterizing irons that sear flesh and fill the air with smoke, the curved needles used to stitch wounds that refuse to heal. Each procedure causes the king agony, yet he demands more treatments, convinced that somewhere among your arsenal of medieval medicine lies the cure for his ailments. You know there is no cure. His body is failing from the inside out, ravaged by diseases and poisoned by the very treatments meant to save him. The astronomical costs of treating the king have begun to bankrupt the royal treasury. Rare ingredients must be imported from the farthest corners of the known world. Teams of physicians and surgeons demand enormous fees for their services. Alchemists work day and night to create new potions and elixirs. The king's medical expenses now exceed the cost of maintaining his entire navy. Yet Henry continues to demand the most exotic and expensive treatments, believing that his divine right as king entitles him to miraculous cures that ordinary mortals cannot access. Your sleep is tormented by nightmares of the king's rotting body. You dream of maggots crawling through his wounds, of pus flowing like rivers through the palace corridors. You wake in cold sweats, your hands shaking as you remember the feeling of Henry's diseased flesh beneath your fingers. The smell of decay has become so embedded in your clothing and hair that you can never escape it, even in your private chambers. Your own health has begun to suffer from the constant stress and exposure to the king's infections. You have developed a persistent cough that you fear may be consumption. Your hands tremble when you try to write prescriptions. The other physicians at court have begun to turn against each other as Henry's condition worsens. Dr. Wendy blames Dr. Hewick's bloodletting techniques. Dr. Hewick claims that Dr. Wendy's herbal remedies are poisoning the king. You find yourself caught in the middle of these accusations, knowing that when the king finally dies, someone must be held responsible. The surviving physicians will likely face charges of incompetence or even murder. You have already begun making secret plans for your escape from England, should the worst come to pass. The king's dining habits have become increasingly erratic as his mental state deteriorates. He sometimes eats nothing for days, then gorges himself on enormous quantities of meat and wine. His weight fluctuates wildly, and his already massive frame struggles to support the additional burden of his swollen, infected leg. You have prescribed various diets and fasting regimens, but Henry ignores your advice, preferring to indulge his appetites even as they worsen his condition. His diabetes, though you do not yet understand the disease, causes him to drink enormous quantities of water and wine, leading to frequent urination that further weakens his already fragile constitution. The palace has become a place of whispered conversations and furtive glances. Courtiers speculate about what will happen when Henry dies. Will his young son Edward be able to maintain control of the kingdom? Will the various religious factions tear England apart in a civil war? You listen to these conversations with growing dread, knowing that your own fate is tied to that of the dying king. If Henry's enemies seize power after his death, they will likely execute everyone associated with his reign, including his physicians. Your medical journals, once filled with optimistic notes about potential cures and promising treatments, now read like a chronicle of failure and despair. Each entry documents another failed remedy, another worsening symptom, another step closer to the inevitable end. You have begun to suspect that some of your treatments have actually hastened the king's decline, but you dare not admit this even to yourself. The weight of this knowledge threatens to crush your spirit entirely. The young physicians who once sought your guidance now avoid you entirely. They see the futility of treating the king and want no part in the coming disaster. You find yourself increasingly isolated, surrounded only by the other senior physicians who, like you, are trapped by their positions and unable to escape. You share knowing looks with Dr. Wendy and Dr. Hewick, understanding that you are all likely doomed to share the same fate as your royal patient. Henry's rages have become so violent that even his closest advisors fear for their lives. He has threatened to execute his current wife, Catherine Parr, for questioning his medical treatments. He has ordered the torture of servants who displease him. His paranoia has reached such heights that he sees assassination attempts in every meal, poison in every cup of wine. You must now taste every medicine before administering it to the king, risking your own life with each dose of mercury or arsenic-laced potion. The smell of death hangs over the palace like a shroud. Not just from the king's rotting leg, but from the very atmosphere of fear and desperation that permeates every corridor. Servants whisper prayers as they go about their duties. Courtiers make secret preparations to flee the country. Even the king's food tasters have begun requesting transfers to other positions, terrified of being blamed for Henry's inevitable demise. Your hands, once steady and sure when performing surgery, now shake uncontrollably whenever you approach the king's bedside. The constant stress and fear have taken their toll on your own body and mind. You have developed a nervous tic, constantly checking over your shoulder for signs of danger. Your appetite has disappeared entirely, and you have lost so much weight that your physician's robes hang loose on your frame like burial shrouds. The irony of your situation is not lost on you. You, who dedicated your life to healing, have become an unwitting instrument of torture and death. Every treatment you administer causes the king more pain. Every remedy you prescribe hastens his decline. You are trapped in a nightmare of your own making, unable to help your patient and unable to escape the consequences of your failure. The Hippocratic oath to first do no harm has become a cruel mockery in the face of medieval medicine's brutal limitations. As winter approaches, you know that time is running out. Henry's body cannot survive much longer in its current state. The infection in his leg has spread throughout his system. His brain, poisoned by mercury and damaged by trauma, continues to deteriorate. His heart, strained by his enormous weight and constant stress, beats irregularly in his chest. You estimate that he has weeks, perhaps months, before the end comes. And when it does, you pray that your own death will be swift and merciful, for you know that the king's physicians will not be allowed to outlive their patient by very long. The weight of history presses down upon you as you realize you are witnessing the final act of one of England's most notorious monarchs. Future generations will remember Henry VIII as a king who changed the course of English history, who broke with Rome and established the Church of England. But you will remember him as a man whose body became a battlefield between disease and medicine, where medicine lost decisively. You are not just treating a king, you are presiding over the slow, agonizing death of the Tudor dynasty itself. By 1540, Henry VIII's health has reached a catastrophic turning point. What began as a simple leg injury has now transformed into a nightmare that will haunt his final years. The wound, originally sustained during a jousting accident in 1536, has become a festering, putrid mass that refuses to heal. Day after day, his physicians watch in horror as the infection spreads, turning the flesh around the wound black and necrotic. The stench is unbearable. Even from across the room, courtiers can smell the sickly, sweet odor of rotting flesh mixed with the metallic tang of blood and pus. The king's attendants struggle to hide their revulsion as they change his bandages, revealing wounds that seem to grow larger and more grotesque with each passing day. What was once a minor laceration has become a gaping chasm in his leg, oozing a constant stream of yellow-green discharge that soaks through even the thickest dressings within hours. Dr. William Butts, the king's most trusted physician, stands at Henry's bedside with trembling hands. He has tried everything in his arsenal of medieval remedies, but nothing seems to work. The bleeding continues, weakening the king further with each day. Butts has applied countless leeches to drain what he believes are the corrupt humours, but instead of healing, the wounds only seem to attract more putrefaction. The flesh around the ulcers has taken on a mottled appearance, purple and black in some places, angry red in others. The mercury treatments, once hailed as a miracle cure for the king's suspected syphilis, have now become a source of additional torment. Henry's mouth is filled with painful sores, his gums have receded to expose blackened teeth, and his breath carries the metallic taste of the poison coursing through his veins. The constant salivation caused by mercury poisoning leaves him drooling uncontrollably, adding to his humiliation and rage. But perhaps most terrifying of all is what the physical deterioration has done to Henry's mind. The once charismatic monarch, who could charm ambassadors and intimidate enemies with equal skill, has become an unpredictable tyrant, prone to violent outbursts that leave everyone around him walking on eggshells. His paranoia has reached new heights. He sees conspiracies everywhere. Suspects every whispered conversation is plotting against him, and flies into murderous rages at the slightest provocation. Dr. George Owen, a younger physician who has recently joined the royal medical team, watches nervously as the king's mood shifts like a weather vane in a storm. One moment, Henry is laughing at a jest. The next, he is screaming for someone's head to be removed from their shoulders. Owen has witnessed the king order the execution of servants for minor infractions, then forget about it entirely an hour later, only to fly into another rage when reminded of his command. The king's weight has ballooned to enormous proportions. What was once a powerful athletic frame has become a grotesque caricature of royalty. Henry now weighs well over 300 pounds, his legs unable to support his massive bulk without assistance. He must be carried everywhere in a specially constructed chair, and even the simple act of standing requires the help of multiple servants. His clothing must be constantly adjusted and reinforced to accommodate his ever-expanding girth. The medical team has tried everything they can think of. They have applied poultices made from ground pearls and unicorn horn, believing these precious substances might have magical healing properties. They have attempted to balance his humours with increasingly desperate combinations of bloodletting and purging. Dr. Butts has even resorted to cauterizing the wounds with red-hot irons, filling the royal chambers with the sickening smell of burning flesh as Henry screams in agony. Each treatment seems to make things worse. The cauterization has left Henry's legs covered in additional scars and burns, creating new sources of infection. The bloodletting has weakened him to the point where he can barely stay conscious for more than a few hours at a time. The purging has left him dehydrated and malnourished, his body struggling to maintain even basic functions. Dr. Owen finds himself questioning everything he learned at university. The ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates, once sacred medical doctrine, now seem like cruel jokes in the face of Henry's suffering. The theory of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, that has guided medical practice for over 1,000 years, appears utterly useless when confronted with the reality of the king's condition. The psychological toll on the medical staff is becoming unbearable. Dr. Butts has developed a nervous tic, constantly wringing his hands as he paces the corridors outside the king's chambers. He knows that if Henry dies under his care, he will likely follow his patient to the grave, accused of incompetence or even treason. The pressure to find a cure has driven him to desperate measures, including consulting with known charlatans and quack doctors who promise miracle remedies. Meanwhile, the infection continues to spread. What started as a single wound has now become multiple ulcers covering both of Henry's legs. The flesh around these wounds has begun to die and slough off, creating an ever-widening area of necrosis. The smell has become so overwhelming that the king's chambers must be constantly fumigated with burning herbs and incense, but even this does little to mask the stench of decay. Henry's sleep is fitful and filled with nightmares. When he does manage to doze, he often awakens screaming, convinced that his enemies are closing in around him. The constant pain has made him increasingly dependent on wine and various herbal concoctions that promise relief, but deliver only temporary numbness. His speech has become slurred, partly from the mercury poisoning and partly from the alcohol he consumes to dull his agony. The king's courtiers have begun to avoid him whenever possible. Those who must attend him wear pomanders filled with strong-smelling herbs to mask the odor, and many have taken to breathing through their mouths to avoid the full impact of the stench. The once vibrant court life has become a grim procession of forced smiles and whispered fears about what will happen when the king finally succumbs to his ailments. Dr. Owen has begun keeping a secret journal documenting the progression of Henry's illness, though he knows that if it were discovered, it would mean his death. In his private notes, he describes the horror of watching a human being slowly rot from the inside out while still alive. He writes about the king's delusions, his violent mood swings, and the gradual decay of his once formidable intellect. The younger physician has also begun to suspect that some of their treatments are actually making the king worse. The mercury, he believes, may be poisoning Henry's brain, explaining his erratic behavior and cognitive decline. The constant bloodletting is clearly weakening him rather than providing any benefit. But Dr. Owen dare not voice these doubts aloud, knowing that to question established medical practice would be seen as heretical and potentially treasonous. As winter approaches, Henry's condition continues to deteriorate. The wounds have now begun to affect his ability to digest food properly, and he frequently vomits up whatever he manages to consume. His body is slowly cannibalizing itself, breaking down muscle and fat to try to fuel his immune system's futile battle against the spreading infection. The medical team has resorted to increasingly desperate measures. They have tried applying maggots to the wounds, hoping the creatures will consume only the dead flesh and leave healthy tissue behind. They have attempted to draw out the infection using heated cups and complex arrangements of tubes and pumps. They have even brought in foreign doctors from across Europe, each claiming to have secret knowledge that could save the king's life. But nothing works. If anything, Henry seems to be dying more quickly now, as if his body has finally given up the fight. The infections have spread to his bloodstream, causing periodic fevers that leave him delirious and raving. During these episodes, he sometimes doesn't recognize his own physicians, accusing them of being assassins sent to finish him off. Dr. Butts knows that the end is approaching, and he has begun making preparations for his own likely execution. He has written letters to his family, disposed of his more valuable possessions, and made peace with his God. The other physicians are similarly preparing for the worst, knowing that in Henry's England, failure to cure the king is often seen as a crime punishable by death. The irony is not lost on any of them that in trying to save Henry's life, they may have hastened his death. Their bleedings have weakened him, their mercury treatments have poisoned him, and their various surgical interventions have created new opportunities for infection. They are trapped in a medical nightmare of their own making, bound by centuries of flawed medical theory and the terrifying knowledge that admitting their mistakes could cost them everything. As 1540 draws to a close, King Henry VIII lies dying, and his doctors can only watch helplessly as their patient and their own lives slip slowly away into darkness. By the time we reach the year 1541, you have become intimately acquainted with the king's decline. What began as a festering wound has transformed into something far more sinister. The ulcer on Henry's leg now pulses with a rhythm of its own, a grotesque metronome marking time toward his inevitable doom. The flesh around it has turned a sickly greenish black, and the smell that emanates from beneath the bandages is so putrid that even the most hardened servants gag when they enter the royal chambers. You have tried everything in your arsenal of medieval medicine, and each attempt has only made things worse. The mercury treatments, once hailed as miraculous cures, have left the king's mouth a landscape of decay. His teeth, once white and strong, now hang loose in blackened gums that bleed at the slightest touch. His breath carries the metallic tang of mercury poisoning, mixed with the sweet rot of infection. When he speaks, which he does less and less, spittle mixed with blood sprays from his lips. The bloodletting sessions have become exercises in futility. Where once you drew bright red blood, now only dark, thick fluid emerges, sometimes mixed with pus that tells you the infection has spread deep into his system. The king's body has become a battlefield, where every organ fights a losing war against the poisons you have inadvertently introduced in your desperate attempts to heal him. His weight has ballooned to enormous proportions. The king who once cut a striking figure in his youth now requires specially constructed chairs and beds to support his massive frame. His legs can barely carry him, swollen as they are with fluid that seems to accumulate faster than it can be drained. The constant pain from his ulcers has made movement agony, and he spends most of his days propped up in bed, his breathing laboured and shallow. But perhaps most terrifying of all is what the illness has done to his mind. The Henry you once knew, terrible though he was, at least possessed a sharp intellect and cunning political instincts. Now his thoughts drift like smoke, coherent one moment and completely mad the next. He sees enemies in every shadow, traitors in every loyal servant. His paranoia has reached such heights that he has ordered the execution of 3 court physicians in the past month alone, convinced they were conspiring to poison him. You have watched in horror as his mood swings have become increasingly violent and unpredictable. One moment, he might be weeping like a child over some imagined slight from his youth. The next, he is screaming for someone's head to be brought to him on a platter. The mercury has addled his brain, creating a toxic fog that transforms every thought into suspicion, every memory into a potential betrayal. The king's appetite has become another source of concern. Despite his massive weight gain, he eats with the desperation of a starving man, consuming enormous quantities of rich foods that his diseased body can no longer properly digest. He demands sugary confections at all hours, and his servants report finding him in the middle of the night, stuffing his mouth with honeyed cakes while tears stream down his bloated face. You suspect he has developed what we would now recognize as diabetes, though such knowledge is centuries beyond your understanding. His constant thirst, his ravenous appetite, the sweet smell that sometimes accompanies his breath, the slow healing of his wounds, all point to a condition that medieval medicine cannot even name, let alone treat. The rich diet that befits a king has become another poison in his system, feeding the very illnesses that are consuming him from within. The treatments you continue to prescribe have become increasingly desperate and dangerous. The cauterization sessions, where you burn the infected flesh with red-hot irons, leave the king screaming in agony for hours afterward. The smell of burning human flesh has become so common in the royal chambers that it no longer surprises anyone. Yet the wounds refuse to heal properly, and within days of each cauterization, the infection returns with renewed vigor. The leeching treatments have evolved into medieval torture sessions. You apply dozens of the writhing creatures to his swollen legs, watching as they gorge themselves on his tainted blood. But rather than providing relief, the leeches seem to introduce new infections, their bites becoming small, weeping sores that join the constellation of wounds already covering the king's body. Your experiments with various poultices and herbal remedies have taken on an air of desperate alchemy. You mix ground pearls with unicorn horn powder, believing in the magical properties attributed to these substances. You prepare tinctures of gold, convinced that the noble metal might restore nobility to the king's corrupted flesh. Each remedy is more exotic and expensive than the last, as if the price itself might guarantee effectiveness. The king's physicians, what few remain, have begun to avoid you in the corridors. They see the fear in your eyes, the trembling in your hands as you prepare each new treatment. They know, as you know, that you are not healing the king, but merely prolonging his agony. Yet none dare speak this truth aloud, for to admit failure in treating the king is to sign one's own death warrant. The court has become a place of whispered conversations and furtive glances. Nobles who once jockeyed for position near the king now find excuses to remain far from his presence. The stench that follows him has become so overwhelming that even the most ambitious courtiers cannot stomach it for long. Those forced to attend him in his chambers breathe through cloths soaked in perfume, though even this provides little relief. You have begun to notice that the king's condition affects everyone around him in strange ways. Servants who tend to him develop mysterious ailments. Guards who stand watch outside his chambers complain of headaches and nausea. And even the priests who come to give him comfort often leave looking pale and shaken. It is as if the very air around Henry has become poisonous, infected with the same corruption that is eating him alive. The royal chambers themselves have become a charnel house. Despite the constant burning of incense and the frequent changing of linens, nothing can mask the smell of decay that permeates every surface. The walls seem to sweat with moisture that carries the king's sickness, and the floors are stained with the various fluids that leak from his diseased body. Even the gold and silver ornaments that decorate the room have begun to tarnish more quickly than usual, as if the very presence of the king's illness corrodes everything it touches. Your own health has begun to suffer from the constant exposure to the king's condition. You have developed a persistent cough that you attribute to the various vapors and smokes used in your treatments. Your hands shake more frequently now, whether from the stress of your position or from some contagion you have picked up in the course of your duties. You have lost weight despite eating well, and you often find yourself waking in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweats and haunted by dreams of the king's rotting flesh. The other physicians whisper that the king's illness is divine punishment for his many sins, his treatment of his wives, his break with Rome, his dissolution of the monasteries. They speak of it as a curse that spreads to all who try to interfere with God's judgment. You try to dismiss such superstitions, but as the months wear on and your treatments fail again and again, you begin to wonder if there might be truth in their words. The king's relationship with his current wife, Catherine Parr, has become another source of tension and danger. She has proven remarkably resilient in the face of his deteriorating condition, but even she struggles to hide her revulsion at his appearance and smell. You have seen the way she holds her breath when forced to kiss him, the way she flinches when his diseased skin touches hers. Yet she dares not show any sign of displeasure. For Henry's paranoia has reached such heights that he interprets every expression, every gesture, as potential evidence of betrayal. The king has begun to speak frequently of his other wives, often confusing Catherine Parr with her predecessors. In his mercury-addled mind, the past and present blur together into a nightmarish tapestry of suspicion and rage. He sometimes calls Catherine by Anne Boleyn's name, then flies into a fury when she fails to respond appropriately. Other times he weeps for Catherine of Aragon, begging forgiveness for sins he cannot clearly remember committing. You have become privy to the king's most private moments, and what you have witnessed would terrify the bravest soul. You have seen him speaking to invisible accusers, arguing with ghosts of his executed wives and ministers. He sometimes spends hours staring at his reflection in polished metal, poking at his swollen features and whimpering like a frightened child. The mighty king who once struck fear into the hearts of all Europe has been reduced to a bloated, paranoid madman whose own body has become his prison. The political implications of the king's condition have not escaped your notice. Foreign ambassadors who once sought audiences with Henry now conduct their business through intermediaries, claiming that pressing matters in their own countries prevent them from waiting for the king's availability. In truth, word of his deterioration has spread throughout Europe, and other monarchs are already positioning themselves for the chaos that will surely follow his death. Your position has become increasingly precarious as the king's condition worsens. Each failed treatment brings you closer to joining the growing list of physicians who have been executed for their inability to cure him. You have seen the way his eyes follow you around the room, calculating and suspicious, as if he is weighing whether your continued existence serves any purpose. The knowledge that your life hangs by the thinnest of threads has become a constant weight on your shoulders. The medicines you prepare have become increasingly exotic and expensive, as much to demonstrate your continued efforts as to provide any actual benefit. You import rare herbs from the far corners of the known world, ground precious stones into powders, and distill the essences of flowers that bloom only under specific celestial conditions. Each remedy costs a fortune, but money is no object when it comes to preserving the illusion that the king can still be healed. Yet despite all your efforts, all your knowledge, all your desperate innovations, the king continues his inexorable slide toward death. His body has become a catalogue of everything that medieval medicine could do wrong. The treatments meant to cure have become the instruments of torture. The remedies have become poisons, and the healing arts have become a prolonged exercise in causing suffering. As you prepare for another day of futile treatments, you cannot help but reflect on the irony of your situation. You have achieved the highest position possible in your profession, personal physician to the King of England, yet you have never felt more powerless or more afraid. The knowledge that your best efforts are not only failing but actively harming your patient weighs heavily on your conscience. But the alternative to continuing is death. The king's morning routine has become a grotesque parody of royal ceremony. Where once he was bathed and dressed with pomp and dignity, now armies of servants struggle to clean the infected fluids from his body and change the bandages on his festering wounds. The process takes hours and requires the strength of multiple men to move his massive, diseased form. Through it all, Henry alternates between screaming in pain and muttering incoherent threats against imagined enemies. And so you continue, trapped in this nightmare of your own professional making, watching helplessly as the most powerful man in England rots away before your eyes, knowing that each treatment you prescribe brings him closer to death, yet unable to stop for fear of your own life, caught in a web of medieval medicine, royal paranoia, and your own desperate desire to survive in a world where failure means death and success seems impossible to achieve. By 1545, the end was approaching for Henry VIII, and for you, as his physician, the final years had become a waking nightmare of escalating madness, putrefying wounds, and treatments that bordered on medieval torture. The king's health had deteriorated beyond recognition from the vigorous monarch who had once dominated European politics. His legs, now grotesquely swollen and blackened with gangrene, leaked pus continuously through bandages that had to be changed multiple times daily. The stench was so overwhelming that courtiers would hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when in his presence, though none dared show their revulsion openly. Your medical arsenal had expanded to include increasingly desperate measures. Trepanation, the drilling of holes into the skull to release evil humours, had become a regular procedure despite its horrific risks. You would position the crude metal drill against the king's temple while he was held down by 4 strong men, the grinding sound of metal against bone echoing through the chamber as blood streamed down his face. The king's screams would fill the palace, followed by periods of unconsciousness that offered temporary respite from his ravings about conspiracies and phantom enemies. The mercury treatments had reached toxic levels, causing his teeth to fall out one by one, his gums to recede into bloody, infected cavities, and his speech to become increasingly slurred and incomprehensible. His hands shook uncontrollably, making it impossible for him to sign documents or hold eating utensils. Servants had to feed him liquid porridge and wine through straws, as solid food would simply fall from his mouth. The neurological damage was evident in his erratic behavior. He would fly into murderous rages over trivial matters, ordering executions for imagined slights, then collapse into sobbing fits where he would call for his long-dead mother. The king's paranoia had reached such heights that he suspected everyone, including you, of trying to poison him. He would refuse medicines, convinced they contained deadly toxins, then demand different treatments while threatening to have you beheaded if you failed to cure him. You lived in constant terror, knowing that each failed remedy brought you closer to the chopping block. Other physicians had already fled the court or met gruesome ends. Dr. Lineker had been imprisoned for suggesting the king's condition was incurable, while Dr. Butts had died under mysterious circumstances after questioning the mercury treatments. Sleep had become impossible as the king's condition worsened. His infected leg wound had developed into full-blown sepsis, causing high fevers that left him delirious for days at a time. During these episodes, he would speak to people who weren't there, argue with his deceased wives, and issue contradictory orders that threw the entire court into chaos. The smell of rotting flesh permeated his chambers despite constant cleaning, and flies buzzed around his bandages, adding to the medieval horror of the scene. Your own health had suffered tremendously from the stress and exposure to the king's diseases. The constant bloodletting procedures had left your hands permanently stained, and the mercury vapors from his treatments had begun affecting your own nervous system. You experienced tremors, memory lapses, and a persistent metallic taste in your mouth. The ethical weight of your position had become unbearable. You knew your treatments were hastening the king's death rather than healing him, yet to stop would mean certain execution. The court had become a place of whispered conversations and fearful glances. Nobles who had once competed for the king's favour now avoided him, terrified of his unpredictable violence. Queen Catherine Parr, his 6th wife, had managed to survive by agreeing with everything he said and staying out of his sight as much as possible. The king's children lived in constant fear of their father's wrath, knowing that his paranoid delusions could turn on them at any moment. As 1546 dawned, it was clear that Henry VIII was dying a slow, agonizing death that reflected the brutality of his reign. His body, once powerful enough to joust and hunt for hours, had become a rotting shell kept alive only by your increasingly desperate interventions. The irony was not lost on you. The king who had executed so many now faced his own excruciating end, surrounded by physicians too terrified to let him die naturally and too powerless to truly heal him. Your role as his doctor had become less about medicine and more about prolonging his suffering while protecting yourself from his homicidal paranoia, a grim testament to the corrupting influence of absolute power and the medieval brutality of Tudor medicine. Boring history. Your brutal life as Henry VIII's doctor. Part 12. As we reach the twilight of our journey into the medical nightmare that was serving Henry VIII, we find ourselves in the year 1546, watching the final, agonizing months of a king whose body had become a battlefield of decay and whose mind teetered on the precipice of complete collapse. For those physicians still brave enough or foolish enough to remain in his service, these final months would test every ounce of their medical knowledge, their psychological fortitude, and their sheer will to survive. By November of 1546, Henry's physical condition had deteriorated beyond anything his doctors had previously witnessed. The leg ulcers that had plagued him for over a decade now covered both limbs from ankle to thigh, weeping constantly with a putrid discharge that no amount of cleaning could control. The stench emanating from these wounds was so overwhelming that courtiers would hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses when forced to attend the king, and even his most loyal servants would gag when changing his bandages. Dr. William Butts, now in his 70s, and visibly aged by the stress of serving this impossible monarch, would later write in his private journals about the horror of these final examinations. The king's legs, he noted, had become so swollen and discolored that they resembled tree trunks more than human limbs. The flesh around the wounds had turned a sickly greenish black, and in some places, the infection had eaten so deeply that bone was visible through the rotting tissue. But it wasn't just the physical decay that terrified Henry's remaining physicians. The king's mental state had become increasingly erratic and dangerous. The mercury treatments that had been administered for his suspected syphilis over the years had slowly poisoned his brain, leading to episodes of paranoid rage that could erupt without warning. One moment, he might be discussing military strategy with apparent clarity, and the next, he would be screaming accusations of treason at anyone within reach. Dr. Thomas Vicary, the royal surgeon, bore the brunt of Henry's psychological deterioration. During one particularly harrowing session in December 1546, as Vicary attempted to clean and dress the king's wounds, Henry suddenly grabbed the surgeon's wrist with surprising strength and accused him of trying to poison him through his bandages. For a terrifying moment, Vicary was certain he was about to join the long list of royal physicians who had met their end at the executioner's block. The medical treatments being administered during these final months read like a catalogue of medieval torture. In their desperation to find something, anything, that might provide relief, Henry's doctors resorted to increasingly extreme measures. They continued the bloodletting, now taking enormous quantities of blood from a man who could barely afford to lose any. They applied red-hot cauterizing irons to his wounds, believing that burning away the infected flesh might somehow promote healing. The king's screams during these procedures could be heard throughout the palace corridors. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the attempts at trepanation that some physicians advocated. Believing that the king's increasing madness was caused by an excess of corrupt humours in his brain, they proposed drilling holes in his skull to release the pressure. Fortunately for Henry, even his most desperate doctors recognised that this procedure would almost certainly kill him immediately, though some argued privately that a quick death might be more merciful than the slow agony he was enduring. The exotic remedies reached new heights of absurdity during these final months. Unicorn horn powder, now costing more than its weight in gold, was mixed into every meal and drink the king consumed. Powdered pearls were dissolved in wine and administered hourly. Bezoar stones, supposedly magical concretions found in the stomachs of certain animals, were ground up and applied directly to his wounds. None of these treatments had any effect beyond lightening the royal treasury. The physicians also attempted what they called sympathetic magic, based on the medieval belief that like cured like. Since Henry's condition was thought to be caused by an excess of heat and corruption in his body, they surrounded his bed with cooling stones and had servants fan him constantly with peacock feathers. They fed him foods that were considered cold in nature, such as lettuce and cucumber, while forbidding anything deemed hot, including most meats and spices. Dr. Butts, perhaps the most rational of Henry's remaining physicians, began to suspect that many of their treatments were actually making the king's condition worse. In his private notes, he observed that the mercury treatments seemed to coincide with Henry's most violent outbursts, and that the constant bloodletting was leaving the king so weak that his body couldn't fight off the infections ravaging his system. But to voice these concerns openly would have been tantamount to admitting that the medical establishment had been torturing their patient for years, a revelation that would almost certainly result in execution. The psychological toll on the physicians themselves was becoming unbearable. Dr. George Owen, one of the newer additions to the Royal Medical Team, suffered what we would now recognize as a complete nervous breakdown in January 1547. He was found by servants babbling incoherently about demons and curses and had to be quietly removed from the palace. The official story was that he had taken ill with fever, but those close to the situation knew that the horror of attending the dying king had driven him mad. The remaining doctors lived in a state of constant terror, knowing that Henry's paranoia could turn on them at any moment. They took to travelling in groups, never being alone with the king if they could help it. They tasted each other's medicines before administering them, not out of concern for the king's safety, but to ensure that none of them could later be accused of poisoning the monarch. Sleep became nearly impossible as they waited each night for the sound of guards coming to arrest them on charges of treason or witchcraft. Henry's diet during these final months was a grotesque parody of royal excess. Unable to digest most solid foods due to his various ailments, he subsisted primarily on broths and gruels, but these were prepared with the finest ingredients available. Broths made from swan and peacock, thickened with ground pearls and gold leaf, were spooned into his mouth by trembling servants. Wine mixed with unicorn horn and powdered gemstones was his primary beverage. The cost of feeding the dying king exceeded the annual income of most noble families. The king's bedchamber had become a medieval intensive care unit, filled with the tools and apparatus of Tudor medicine. Brass syringes for administering enemas lined the walls. Cauterizing irons heated constantly in a brazier, ready for the next attempt to burn away infection. Bowls for bloodletting were stacked like dinner plates. The air was thick with the smoke of burning herbs and incense, intended to ward off evil humours but serving mainly to mask the overwhelming stench of decay. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of these final months was watching Henry's moments of clarity, when the fog of pain and poison would lift temporarily and he would become aware of his condition. During these brief interludes, the king who had once terrorized Europe would weep like a child, begging his doctors to end his suffering. He would plead with them to tell him honestly whether he was going to recover, and his physicians, trained in the art of royal deception, would assure him that he was improving while privately preparing for his imminent death. Dr. Butts later wrote that these moments of vulnerability were almost harder to bear than Henry's rages. To see this man, who had wielded absolute power over millions, reduced to a whimpering, pain-racked invalid, was a reminder of the ultimate futility of their profession. All their learning, all their expensive treatments, all their elaborate theories about humours and celestial influences meant nothing in the face of the inexorable advance of death. The financial cost of Henry's medical care during these final months was staggering. The royal accounts show expenditures that would be equivalent to millions of pounds in today's currency, all spent on treatments that were not only useless, but actively harmful. Rare medicines were imported from as far away as China and India. Precious metals and gemstones were ground up and consumed. The most expensive physicians in Europe were summoned to consult, though most found excuses to avoid actually treating the king once they learned of his condition. As Henry's condition worsened, rumours began to circulate throughout the palace and beyond. Some whispered that the king was being kept alive by dark magic, that his physicians had made a pact with the devil to prolong his suffering. Others claimed that he had been cursed by the ghosts of his executed wives, doomed to endure in agony as punishment for his cruelty. The more practically minded suspected that his doctors were deliberately prolonging his life to maintain their own positions, fearing that his death would bring about their own downfall. The reality was far simpler and more tragic. Henry's physicians were trapped in a system that demanded they provide impossible cures while threatening them with death if they failed. They continued their futile treatments not out of hope for success, but out of sheer terror of the consequences of stopping. They had become prisoners of their own medical theories, unable to admit that everything they had learned was wrong, that their patient was beyond help, and that their continued interventions were causing more harm than good. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had joined the Royal Medical Team only a few months before Henry's final decline, would later describe the experience as like being trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. Every day brought new horrors, new evidence of their failure, new reasons to fear for their own lives. They had become accomplices in the slow torture of a dying man, and the weight of that knowledge was crushing their spirits as surely as disease was destroying their patient's body. The king's sleep, when it came at all, was fitful and filled with nightmares. He would cry out in the night, sometimes calling for his long-dead mother, sometimes screaming accusations at invisible enemies. His physicians took turns maintaining a bedside vigil, not to provide comfort, but to ensure that if he died during the night, they would be present to witness it and could not later be accused of murder. As January 1547 progressed, it became clear to everyone except Henry himself that the end was approaching. His breathing became increasingly laboured, his periods of consciousness grew shorter, and his body began to shut down system by system. Yet still his doctors continued their treatments, applying leeches to a man who had no blood to spare, administering purges to intestines that had already ceased to function properly. The final irony was that in their desperate attempts to save Henry's life, his physicians had probably shortened it considerably. The mercury poisoning, the constant bloodletting, the infections introduced by their unsanitary practices, the stress of their painful procedures, all of these factors contributed to hastening the very death they were trying to prevent. They had become unwitting agents of destruction, their every intervention bringing their patient closer to the grave. On January 27th, 1547, as Henry VIII lay dying, his surviving physicians gathered around his bedside one final time. Dr. William Butts, Dr. Thomas Wendy, Dr. George Owen, who had recovered sufficiently from his breakdown to attend, and several others whose names history has forgotten. They watched as the king who had dominated their lives and haunted their nightmares finally succumbed to the accumulated damage of decades of disease and misguided treatment. The official cause of death was recorded as fever, but the physicians present knew the truth was far more complex. Henry had died not of any single ailment, but of the cumulative effect of multiple diseases, toxic treatments, and the medieval medical system's fundamental misunderstanding of the human body. He had been slowly poisoned, bled, burned, and tortured to death by the very men sworn to heal him. In the hours after Henry's death, his physicians faced their greatest test yet. They had to present themselves to the new king, the young Edward VI, and somehow justify their failure to save his father. They had to explain how, despite their learning and their expensive treatments, the most powerful man in England had died in agony under their care. Some would survive this transition and continue their careers. Others would find themselves quietly dismissed, their reputations ruined by their association with the failed treatment of the dead king. Dr. Butts, now in his final years, would spend his remaining time writing detailed accounts of Henry's medical treatment, though he was careful to present their interventions in the most favourable light possible. He understood that history would judge them harshly if the full truth of their medical practices became known. His journals, discovered centuries later, provide a chilling glimpse into the reality of Tudor medicine and the impossible position of royal physicians. The legacy of Henry VIII's medical treatment serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of absolute power combined with primitive medical knowledge. His physicians, trapped between their duty to heal and their fear of execution, became complicit in a system that prioritized political survival over patient welfare. They sacrificed their medical ethics and their peace of mind in service to a monarch whose very nature made effective treatment impossible. For those brave or foolish enough to serve as Henry VIII's doctors, the experience was a descent into a medical hell from which few emerged unscathed. They witnessed the slow destruction of a human being, participated in treatments that bordered on torture, and lived in constant fear for their own lives. Their story is not just a tale of medical failure, but a cautionary tale about the corruption of healing when it becomes entangled with political power and royal paranoia. As we close this examination of your brutal life as Henry VIII's doctor, we are left with a profound appreciation for the advances in medical knowledge and practice that have occurred since the Tudor era. The physicians who attended the dying king were not evil men, but rather victims of their time, trapped in a system that demanded impossible results while providing them with inadequate tools and dangerous theories. Their suffering reminds us that the practice of medicine has always been fraught with uncertainty and moral complexity, but that the combination of political pressure, primitive knowledge, and absolute power can transform healers into unwitting agents of harm. The doctors who served Henry VIII paid a terrible price for their proximity to power, and their story serves as an eternal warning about the dangers of medicine practiced in the shadow of tyranny. In the end, perhaps the greatest tragedy is not that Henry VIII died despite his physicians' efforts, but that so many of those physicians lost their humanity in the process of trying to save him. They became prisoners of a system that valued loyalty over truth, political survival over medical ethics, and royal whim over patient welfare. Their brutal lives serve as a reminder that the practice of medicine, when corrupted by power and fear, can become a form of torture that destroys both patient and healer alike.